Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Jesus Week debate for this year. My name is Tom Worley, and I'm in my 5th year of a chemical engineering and finance degree. I'm also the president of Evangelical Students, a Christian group on campus who are running today's event. The topic for today's discussion is, what if I told you our biggest problem is people? We're delighted that so many people have come today to engage with this topic and to hear a presentation of ideas from 2 educated speakers. This is not a traditional high school style debate with an adjudicator and a winner and loser, but rather a presentation of ideas aiming to stimulate and provoke your own thinking and worldview. I hope that this will be a beneficial time for everybody here. There will also be an opportunity for members of the audience to ask questions of the speakers in a moderated Q&A time. I know that everyone is busy, so we will conclude prior to 2 p.m, allowing everyone to make it to their next commitment on time. The 2 speakers today are Dr. Baltussen, the Hughes Professor of Classics at the University of Adelaide, and Reverend Geoffrey Lin, Anglican Chaplain at the University of Adelaide. Please join me in welcoming both of our speakers. The format for today will be as follows. Both speakers will present one 7-minute address on the topic, what if I told you our biggest problem is people? I will ring a bell once at 6 minutes 30 and then continuously at 7 minutes. Once both speakers have presented, we will conduct a moderated Q&A time. I will outline the guidelines for the Q&A time after both speakers have presented. Please turn your phones onto silent if not already. And I would now like to invite Dr. Baltussen to come forward and to address us. Thank you, Han.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity, and great to see so many people here. Thanks, Geoffrey. Sorry I'm a little overdressed. I just came from another kind of special event. I met the great-great-nephew of Walter Hughes, the person who was involved in founding this university, so it was kind of special. Good. Now, I'll need these. You know, sometimes clear vision is about some additional kind of instruments to help you out. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you, Geoffrey, because I completely agree with his position that it's important to get to know as many perspectives as possible. That's a very valuable thing. My perspective is influenced by the classical world of Greece and Rome, as will become clear very soon. When the great Roman emperor and fan of Stoic thought, Marcus Aurelius, considered the human condition, he mostly wrote about his pursuit of virtue. Here's an example. No one could ever accuse you, and he speaks as if someone's talking to him, of being quick-witted. But there are plenty of other things you can't claim you haven't got it in you. Practice what you can show: honesty, gravity, endurance, austerity, resignation, abstinence, patience, sincerity, moderation, seriousness, high-mindedness. In parallel to such very ambitious goals, he also wrote about the everyday challenge of meeting people. He writes, "Don't be irritated at people's smell or bad breath. What's the point? With that mouth, with those armpits, they are going to produce that odor." End of quote. Now, Marcus was clearly a very patient man and shows himself in these statements also a tolerant man. But why? I think because he kept an eye on the big picture, the important things in life, implying that we should not let the kind of primary sort of impulses let our life be taken away from us. So this Stoic from the 2nd century AD did not think that one should let primary impulses take over to declare people are the biggest problem. And I think, have to agree. The statement, people are the biggest problem, is clearly meant to provoke a particular reaction, but an unexamined claim is really not a useful claim at all. What could the statement really mean? Does it invite us to be misanthropic? By the way, that's a Greek word, which was invented by Plato, talking about hatred for humans. The ancient Roman author Juvenal once sarcastically remarked that man is a wolf to man. I refuse to believe that. simply because of my experience I had in life, and especially after having been allowed to see my children grow up. There's no such thing as an evil child. I would be inclined to qualify the particular statement in the following way. People are sometimes a problem, but they are also the solution. To explain this a little further, I will argue that this thesis puts us at risk of wanting to make decisions about who can stay and who should go. Making such decisions has been imagined in ancient and in modern times by conjuring up ideal societies. But who is to judge? What makes anyone believe that they have the moral right to do so? Plato thought that aristocratic values could allow him to do this, but is anyone ever without a flaw so as to feel justified in taking the moral high ground? Let us consider more realistic scenarios, or as I like to call it, let's move from the necessary to the possible. By this I mean, when you're assessing something so broad and so big, what you should do is start from what cannot be changed and therefore has to be accepted, and then move on to what might follow and for which you do have some influence in determining its outcomes. Now here's the central thesis I would defend. Humans are social animals. Aristotle already understood this, that members of the animal kingdom were dependent on one another. His empirical judgment led him to declare that humans are a zoion politikon, as he called it. We might perhaps translate it as city dwellers, or as I prefer, a social creature. Modern research in social studies confirm that social living is the preferred lifestyle for humans in which they thrive, develop well, and can function best. If, then, we accept this, we cannot easily declare people the problem, because this kind of claim has consequences for how we interact with them. Now, figures like Plato and Epicurus, other philosophers in Greece, each agreed in having animals and humans as animals that live in social environments. But each proposed different forms how to make this work. That is where we enter the realm of the possible and consider how useful it is to talk of ideal societies and to engage in wishful thinking. We are, of course, more comfortable in the company of like-minded people, but that situation can lead to one-sidedness, or to give it a more positive spin, to a missed opportunity of not experiencing other interesting life choices or points of view. Should we then always be on the lookout to go outside of our comfort zone? I think there is no need to be extreme in this, but a healthy dose of curiosity, tolerance, and empathy would help to see the other person's point of view. Here, I admit, Plato's utopian view of an ideal state is of little help, and Epicurus' insistence on a more secluded life in a community based on friendship only gets us so far. We need curiosity to show an interest, and we need a good dose of tolerance to accept that some people may have chosen to live a different life. Emperor Marcus Aurelius clearly thought about the ways in which he sometimes experienced a challenge with his encounters of other people. But his stoic outlook helped him to work up the courage and to display some tolerance, because he knew how to weigh up the small against the large, the trivial against the importance. In other words, he had certain standards to measure these experiences against and assess them appropriately. For this short presentation, I had two particular aims: to share my view on the thesis that was put before us, and to show you how my perspective has been formed by classical training. I hope you have come to see how there is much to learn from other older cultures. But don't let me stop you from learning from today's cultures and human habits. Once the trivial has been recognized, the real value of what's important will become clear. People may be sometimes a problem, but they can also be the solution. Marcus Aurelius was inspired by the first century Stoic thinker Epictetus, clearly one of my favorites. So I end with his words, who encourages us to examine our own views every day. He says, "Examine what appears to you by the rules which you have, but firstly and chiefly by this, whether it concerns the things that are in your power or those which are not. If it belongs to those which are not in your power, be prepared to say it is nothing to you." Being social creatures is so crucial to human beings that we should not feel forced to interacting with others as problems, but rather as an opportunity to enrich our understanding of humankind and human life. This starts from yourself, your immediate circle, and moving into larger and larger circles wherever you are ready. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Han. I would now like to invite Reverend Geoffrey Lin to come forward and to address us. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to address you today. Like Han, I think it's brilliant to see university students who are keen to explore the bigger issues of life and not just how to pass exams. It's also a great honour to share the platform with Han, who, as you've just heard, is a profoundly thoughtful and insightful scholar and a wonderful human being. We have much in common when it comes to our anthropology. We both recognise the dignity and worth of people, as well as humankind's incredible potential to shape our world for better and for worse. However, we do differ significantly in our proposed solutions, and I'd like to outline that in offering an alternative response. As a Christian chaplain, I want to cite just one authority today, that is Jesus of Nazareth. Of his many teachings, two strands are particularly relevant to us. The first is this. Jesus rather bluntly says that the human heart is rotten to the core. I studied law once upon a time, which convinced me beyond all reasonable doubt that we are all legalists who try to get away with as much as we possibly can. Proof of this, of course, comes when we see how people behave when left to their own devices. Consider this incredible account of what happened in peace-loving Canada in 1969. I quote, "At 8 a.m. on the 17th of October, the Montreal police went on strike. By 11:20, the first bank had been robbed. By 12, most downtown stores had closed because of looting. Within a few more hours, taxi drivers burnt down the garage of a limousine service that competed with them for airport customers. A rooftop sniper had killed a provincial police officer. Rioters broke into several hotels and restaurants, and a doctor killed a burglar in his own home. By the end of the day, 6 banks had been robbed, 100 shops had been looted, 12 fires had been set, 40 carloads of storefront glass had been collected, and $3 million in property damage had been inflicted before the city authorities called in the army." According to Jesus, the disease which contaminates each of our hearts is called self-interest. I also have an economics degree, so each summer my wife and I debate the merits of game theory, which show that it's irrational for an individual to follow water restrictions in a drought. If you do, and no one else does, your individual sacrifice will make no difference. If everyone else does, their greater cumulative efforts will cover up your indiscretion, so the rational decision for me is to water my garden 24/7. This diagnosis, I think, rings true on a national scale. Is not the rhetoric, "turn back the boats," merely a grown-up way of saying, we were here first and we don't want to share? And it's true on a global scale. Is not the failure of our world leaders to tackle arguably the biggest threat to humankind today, climate change, merely the international community saying, someone else should pay for it, just not us? If this is what people are like at core, then, and this is where Han and I differ, it seems to me that even if we're able to diagnose the problem, we cannot participate in implementing any solution. For all of our talk of the golden rule, treat others the way you would have them treat you, our inability to do so consistently and completely poses an insurmountable hurdle. If all we have is people power, we're ultimately doomed to repeat our predecessors' mistakes, because we're no better than them. For all our technological advances, the one thing which never ever changes is the human heart, which is why history repeats. Yes, we humans are capable of doing much good, but we're just not good enough. We'd love to think we could get better over time, but the story of humankind shatters any such wishful thinking. So what we need, I think, is something or someone external to us, who is better than us, who is unsullied by us, to change us in a way that we cannot change ourselves. And that brings me then to the second strand of Jesus' teaching, and I think this is the focal point of our difference. Jesus claims to be that external change agent. He claims to be the one that we so desperately need. He says that despite our failings, he doesn't give up on us. He claims to be God-made man who steps into our world to break that Groundhog Day cycle in which we have become enslaved. And he lives a perfectly moral life as an example for us to follow, but more importantly, he says to atone for our failures. And he sacrifices his own life as the supreme demonstration of his love and concern for us. Finally, he says that he has the awesome power to change and remake us. And this is the part that will cause some controversy. He says that if we all lived the way in which Jesus did, the world would be a better place. That is, to stir the pot, he said that we would be better off if everyone became Christians. Or to be even more provocative, he even said that Christian communities right now are salt and light to the world around us. That's right. You have heard me say it today. To every student at Adelaide Uni who is seeking light, I have just claimed that the conduct of Christians ought to illuminate the way for every man, woman and child to follow. Feel free to ask about that in question time if you would like. Jesus offers the possibility of being changed from within by someone who is from without, who is better than us in every way. What Jesus claims is that he can reshape and reform our hearts, free from vice and corruption. That's the reason why, despite being somewhat pessimistic about human nature, Christians don't give up on people altogether, because Jesus didn't. Perhaps could I invite you to consider what kind of difference someone like Jesus might make in your life. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. We'll now proceed into the Q&A time of today's discussion. This is a chance for you to ask questions of Han and Jeff regarding the topic on which they have just spoken. I ask that you keep all questions on topic, and as moderator, I have the right to refuse questions that I deem to be inappropriate. And please make sure that all questions are actually questions. This isn't a chance for everyone to stand up on their soapbox. Please also be respectful of other members of the audience and of the two speakers here today. Questions will be kept to 30 seconds in length, and each speaker will have 2 minutes to answer. I'll ring the bell at 1 minute 30 and then again continuously at 2 minutes. When asking your question, please outline who you're asking the question of, Han, Jeff, or both. When I open the floor for questions, please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. I will then make reference to someone, invite him or her to stand and ask their question. Please speak loudly and clearly so that all members of the audience can also hear you. After you have asked your question, you may be seated. Once the speaker has completed their answer, I will open the floor again for questions following the same process. So, to kick us off, I will now open the floor up, and if anyone would like to ask a question, you can please raise your hand, then I will indicate, and you can stand or remain seated but speak loudly so that we all can hear. Yes?
Can we start asking questions yet?
Yes, sure, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, sure.
I have a question for Reverend Lin. So you have argued that Christianity and Jesus' teachings are a solution to the world's problems, which is people's evil nature. However, both anecdotal and empirical evidence suggests that Christians today do not necessarily behave any better than non-Christians. And so how is that consistent with your argument that Christian teaching and Christian people can solve the world's problems?
Thank you. Reverend Lin?
Thanks for asking the question. That's a really good observation to make. I have tried to claim that Christian communities show a point of difference, and in fact one for the better, and you're right in pointing out that that's not always the case. How do I respond to that? A couple of things I'd say. The first is, I'm not trying to pretend that Christian communities are perfect. Clearly they're not. And I'm also all too conscious, as we all are, of mistakes that Christians have made, for which, in fact, there's nothing to be said other than to apologise and not to try and defend their actions. What I would like to also say, though, is that a Christian community that follows what Jesus teaches, I think at least has a high intention and a high goal. That is, Jesus is the one who will talk about loving your neighbour, even at cost to yourself. And if that's implemented, I think that has enormous potential. I understand that it doesn't always work, but at least that's what they're striving for, and I think that's worth bearing in mind. The other comment that I'd make is that although I have tried to link what Jesus teaches with the conduct of his followers, I think ultimately whatever decision you make about who Jesus was and what he claimed to be is based on him first and foremost. So whilst recognising that the way in which his followers act is significant, I'd still encourage people to consider what Jesus himself did and acted, because he did act and implement what he talked about with complete integrity in the way in which, sadly, his believers haven't often done so. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Jeff. Now we'll continue to take questions from the floor. Yes, up the back.
This question's for Han. So you mentioned that people can be the problem, but they can also be the solution. So in what kind of ways would you suggest that they could be the solution?
Thank you. Over to you, Han.
Thank you for your question. I started answering, because of course 7 minutes is really very brief, so I give a bit of a sketch of some of the elements that I wanted to bring in. But I started to answer that question by looking at an example like Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus. And the way in which that works is that I believe in intrinsic goodness of humans. It's just that sometimes the circumstances don't really help. And I know that there is such a thing as temptation. I know there's such a thing as, being drawn to one direction while you should go the other way. We have that every day. If you want to go past a bakery and see this lovely chocolate cake, there is this kind of notion of maybe I should not take this, but you're still drawn in to go and eat that. That kind of internal conflict that we have all the time, and this is a trivial example, but it could be in more serious situations about more serious questions. I think that what they do is make sure that if you self-examine your position on a regular basis. I mean, Epictetus says you do it every morning, as it were. And I got a little bit depressed, Geoffrey, by your talk, because if Jesus really did say, or if one of the sort of Gospels really does report that he said that human heart is rotten to the core, then I'm really quite disappointed. I've always been very confused by the Gospels, but that's another matter because they have so many different versions of the story. But basically what I would say is, I come from an optimistic perspective, and the self-examination process, which also was a principle that Socrates adhered to, allows us to do something that self-corrects. And I think that that's a possible way to go. Hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Han. And now for further questions. Yes?
I have a question for Jeff. Jeff, what made you believe that Jesus was a credible source?
Over to you.
Thanks for asking the question. What made me believe that Jesus was a credible source? And I guess even just hearing from Han a moment ago, just in reference to the fact that there's a number of different accounts of Jesus' life, and they don't all say the same thing in many ways, in the same ways which, of course, if a group of us were to write up an account of today's session, we'd say slightly different things about what took place, even though we might be describing the same event. I think for me, in the end, I think if you read an account of Jesus' life, it bears what I'd call the ring of truth about it. I understand that lots of people read it and it doesn't, but I think as I read it, it tells of a person who I think understands what people are like, and yet at the same time doesn't give up on them. So again, I do apologise to Han. I didn't mean to depress you today. It's a lovely day today, but And I know that by nature, well, what can I say? I was a lawyer once upon a time. I'm somewhat cynical and pessimistic about human nature. But at the same time, I think as you read about what Jesus describes, I think he accurately diagnoses what we're like. We don't want to hear that often because the things that he says about us, they are confronting and they are personal. But as I tried to show, at the same time as being an accurate, I think, portrayal of human nature, he also does offer hope. That is, it's not an abandonment of saying, oh, well, why bother trying? Because that really would be despairing, I think. So I think for me, and, in a sense, you're at university, you're here to learn. I'd encourage you also to take the time to read an account of Jesus' life and see what you think of it, not just read what other people say about it on the internet, if I can put it that way around. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jeff. And now we will take further questions. Yes?
Yeah, I'll ask direct this question to Han. How would examining oneself every day would change the person in acting in a self-motivated way, which is the cause of all selfishness, when we do all bad stuff. So how self-examination would change our behavior from self-interest?
Thank you. Over to you, Han.
Now, we only have until 2, because this is a really tough one. So thank you for your question. The shorter version of it is that examining, as Epictetus was suggesting, also requires you to measure yourself against something. I understand, in a way, Jeff is arguing that there has to be something outside of you. What people like the Stoics would say is that, for instance, you need some kind of measure against which you would actually try to establish whether you're on the right track. Is that right? So it really requires you to have a broader idea about the world, what the universe is about in a way, and from a Christian point of view, that has a certain story. The Stoics have also got a story for that, and how we fit into that. And if you then have established the role of what humans can do to fit into that bigger picture, then you start to establish what kind of measure is there to say, I actually now fit the kind of function that I think I should be fulfilling. And that's how this normally works within the Stoic kind of perspective. They say, I know that humans can have a function as social beings in furthering both their own interests, because that's fundamental. You shouldn't abandon your own interests. I mean, it's a different question from what Jeff is saying about humans are too self-interested, but you have a right to defend your own self-interest. But then beyond that, go into, as the Stoics say, the circles of society. And from your family, your friends, and the wider community, and maybe the whole nation, think about what kind of role you can play there. So there is a very deep social function for humans that the Stoics believe in that starts with your own position in that bigger picture. That's really how it works. And if you want to know more about that, you would have to really have, a full lecture on what the Stoics believe about that. But that's basically how it would work. Thanks.
Thank you, Han. Now for further questions. Yes, we'll go right up the back. Yeah.
As Christians, we believe that we're inherently sinful, but don't we also believe that we're inherently good at the same time because we're made in the image of God?
Who are you directing your question to? Jeff? Okay, over to you, Jeff.
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear. I think you said, could you just repeat the question? Yeah, thanks. So the question is about, I've talked about people being, the word that was used is sinful. We also believe that people are good because they're made, as Christians talk about being made in the image of God. That is one of the things that Christian teaching does focus on. I've chosen not to do that today much, only for lack of time. In a sense, that lies behind much of what I've talked about today. So when I tried to say that people, though they might intend well, nevertheless continually fail to live up to even their own expectations, let alone the expectations of others. Therefore, we need something external to make a change to us. That's the idea that Christians, and in fact theists of all religions, adhere to. That is, there is something external to us. And one of the things about Christianity is that it talks about people being particularly made in God's image, and the demonstration of that being that Jesus is the one who the word that's used is God become man. Now, that's kind of a technical discussion which I don't really need to get into today. Part of what you're raising, though, is the question of where does the sense of goodness come from? And I think it's probably fair to say that in the end, my view is that inherently, though we do have some good traits to us and we do good things, nevertheless, we are still in some way corrupt. And I've tried to argue that from our own experience, let alone from what other authorities say. I think we know that, particularly when we suffer at the hands of others. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And now there was a question in the back row, so I'll go to you.
This question for Jeff. Briefly in your talk you mentioned that Christians have a slightly higher standard, supposedly, for being good. Could you just briefly kind of elaborate on what that means? And does that also mean, for example, if we were all Christian, then the world would be perfect?
Thank you. Over to you, Jeff.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm not playing for time, but there's a coffee machine going behind me. Could you just say the first part of the question again?
That is, in your talk, you briefly mentioned about Christians having a higher standard of being good, or something like that. We talked about, what does that entail? What Christians do that make them better, I suppose?
Thank you. Yes. Thank you for asking the question. I take it you could hear that. Let me apologise if I implied in any way that Christians are inherently better than other people. That's not what I was trying to do, although I might have inadvertently done so. What I was trying to say was that I think that if people chose to act and live and think the way in which Jesus did, that would lead to a generally better outcome for society. That's a fairly modest statement at one level. You might disagree with it, but that was the limit of the statement that I was trying to make. And I do that based simply off the fact that if you examine the character of Jesus, I think he's pretty exemplary in those ways. The second part of your question was, did I actually say if everyone were Christian, the world would be a better place? Well, yes, I did. Being somewhat provocative, I think, because I do recognise that Christians are far from perfect. But as I've tried to argue, I think aiming at least for a particular way of living, even if you don't get there, would still lead to a better outcome for our society. I understand that's fully debatable and contestable, and I'm the first to admit that Christians have got it seriously wrong at times. And as I said before, for which there's no excuse, only an apology. But nevertheless, that's part of the reason why I'm not entirely pessimistic, if I can put it that way around, as I think about my anthropology. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Yes, the question there.
The question's just for Han. I was just wondering if humanity doesn't have any, what's the motivation for humanity to be good, as you say, examine yourself? If most of the stuff which people see nowadays to get it is to act in self-interest, what's the motivation to examine yourself and look beyond your own self-interest to do the right thing? If we're only here for a short amount of time, and there's, as a Christian, I believe there's more to life after death. What's your thoughts on that and motivation to do good stuff?
Thank you. Over to you, Han.
2 minutes. Sorry, I seem to be getting the hard ones. No, it's a very good question. I've been here as the Hughes professor and giving you the views of some of these sort of non-Christian thinkers that mainly to show that there is a very serious streak of thinking going on outside of the Christian tradition. But on a more personal note, I'm not trying to convince people here to start living like a Stoic, right? I'm just trying to show you that there are different ways of looking at the problem, or the question maybe. But if you think that the self-examination is not working, I would be perfectly happy for you to choose a kind of measure, which clearly the New Testament can be, right? A sort of a means to an end, which is Jeff arguing, I'd be perfectly happy with that. But I'd also expect that if someone else is not following that kind of trajectory, that you would respect that as well. That's basically what I'm after. So I was emphasizing the words like tolerance in my little story about Marcus Aurelius because I think that's a very crucial element. Now, I'm actually not convinced about this question, this notion of self-interest, that is such a disease wrecking the place and pervading society as such. I'm not really convinced that is absolutely true. The story about the Canadian disaster might be one that seems to strike you as very sort of important. But statistically, I would really like to know how many people actually were involved in all these things and how many people were not, right? I mean, you need to see the other side of that story as well. So I come from a different place in thinking about how much self-interest is really pernicious, as you might say. But the Stoics would say, if you do something wrong to someone else, it might bounce back on you. So one reason not to be totally bad, let's put it, keep it nice, bad, is that the badness might come back at you, ricochet back at you, because if you treat someone badly, they might have some grudge, right? So instead of doing that, being a force of positive, constructive behavior will actually have the similar effect in echoing back goodness. And I think that's essentially that can be happening in human behavior. I don't think I have time to cover the afterlife business, but I give a course on that, so you can come back next year.
Thank you, Han. Yes, a question at the back.
This is for Professor Han. You said that you believe that humans are intrinsically good, or something along those lines. But how does one establish what deems a good action? Like, what do you base that off without being like, without looking down on different cultures that view good and evil differently and how that plays out?
Thank you.
See, I told you. The question of goodness. I would not like to be a Platonist in this and say that goodness exists with a capital G, because goodness is to some extent what people think it is. Your cross-cultural kind of left field sort of approach to it is a really tricky one, because obviously, although some of the ancient cultures I've studied and I've been talking about, were talking about this kind of notion of a good or a bad act, is normally to do with their outcomes. What is the result of what you do? And then I'm back to my previous answer. But at the same time, it gets more complicated when you think about it in terms of multiple cultures, because then, as you might probably be implying, you've got a range of different types of measures involved, or different kinds of values involved, right? And if that is the case, then I'm back to my answer about tolerance. But tolerance doesn't just mean, let everybody do what they want. It is about an active involvement in thinking hard about what is it that I believe is going on there and how these people sort of act. And in general, I would argue in the direction of, say, what we share in terms of acceptable behavior is probably something that we could start with and then look further at whether what another culture thinks about a certain thing is good or bad or not. But to pass judgment on another culture in this kind of very generalist way is quite impossible for me. I mean, I would have to have a very concrete example to think about that in the proper way, I think. Hope that's not too vague, but this is one of the bigger questions that we've been looking at. Goodness is something to do with how you act and what the result of that is. And I think if you do something that benefits yourself and people around you, who could call that bad?
Thank you, Han. Yes, question here.
Is it alright if I ask a two-part question that is interlinked for both speakers?
Yes, I'll invite both speakers to answer it.
So for Han, if, let's say, ambition and self-interest, as long as that is there, wouldn't it be people will always be people's problems because there's always a winner and a loser? And if there wasn't self-interest, wouldn't society as a whole stop growing?
Okay, I'll is it okay if I invite Han forward to answer, and then I'll get Geoff up afterwards?
If I understood your question correctly, I think I disagree. I don't think everything is about ambition and self-interest. If it were, then indeed you would be right in thinking about how this would really damage society, right? But we wouldn't have a full room like this if this was the way it was, because you wouldn't survive 5 minutes if it was just about ambition and self-interest. We'd be back to, William Golding's, state of nature, where people would just be, clubbing each other over the head with whatever they could find in order to so-called, further their own interests. That's impossible, because you would recognize that your act would have an effect on yourself, not only externally by being possibly wounded, but internally by doing the wrong thing. And this is, again, a strong feature that Christian and pagan cultures actually in antiquity shared. The notion that you are damaging your soul, your spirit, is a notion that holds a high standard to yourself. It's not always about something external, I think. It is about holding your own standards and thinking that I know that this is a good thing to do. And you'll find out if it's not, if other people object or hit you over the head, whatever comes first. So I hope that answers the question, because I think it's a really tricky one in the sense that if everything were just about ambition and self-interest, we wouldn't be here. So I think it's a difficult assumption to make. I wouldn't want to go along with it.
Yeah, thanks, Han. Look, in many ways, I think very similarly to what Han has just said. I apologise if you've heard me try and reduce every decision that every person makes to merely one of self-interest. I've not tried to say that, although, as I said, that might have come across unintentionally. What I am trying to say is that I think that every decision we make is in some way a function of our desire for self-advancement and for self-protection. Sometimes that's a good thing. A parent for a child, as Han referred to before, and the way in which they care for their children, in a sense who belongs to them, that's a good thing. And you're right, that's part of how society advances. But it doesn't answer the question of what does the society stand for and what does it represent, what is it worth, even beyond just the mere output that we come up with. Like Han, in many ways, I think actually what is key for us is working out our motives as to why we do things, because it's practically very hard to assess the value of every decision that you make. We just don't have enough information often. That's the reason why someone like Jesus will constantly talk about examining your heart to understand why you do something, and that being, in a sense, the final barometer or decision barometer for evaluating your decision. So I think this whole sense of self-interest, it's important for us to understand that it fits. Lost my concentration. I might just stop at that point if that's okay. Thank you.
Well, that concludes our time together today. Thank you all for your attention and participation, and I hope that this time has been thought-provoking and of interest to everyone here. I would particularly like to thank both of our speakers, Han and Geoff. Could you both please come forward to accept a small token of our appreciation? If you have any remaining questions, both speakers will remain down the front and are willing to chat with you. If you came along today at the invitation of an ES member, I would encourage you to talk to them about today and feel free to ask them any questions that you may have. Over the rest of this week, evangelical students will be hosting 4 other talks exploring some common questions about Christianity, such as, what if I told you that Jesus feels your pain? Or what if I told you that Jesus hates church hypocrisy more than you do? All talks will be held in this room every day at 1 p.m. You're all very welcome to come along. Please speak to any members in these black jumpers for more details. Thank you for your time today, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.